comment or two when we get to the meeting minutes. But why don't we dive right in? I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussions, and we're on which is about 5 minutes faster than I was hoping we'd be all getting started. So without further ado, is Farhad on the call now?
I have not heard Farhad yet this morning.
Okay. And he has an executive director's report that we have as our second item. But since he's not with us yet, why don't we move on to the meeting?
I'm here if you can hear me.
Now I can hear you, Farhad.
Oh, you can hear me. All right, wonderful. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us remotely. As you can imagine, everybody's been trying to master the techniques in doing remote meetings, and this is actually the largest one we've done. So thank you for your patience. So just I want to take a quick opportunity to again thank you for your leadership and your time and willing to participate as a CAC member. From time to time, we'll give you updates on some of the activities that are ongoing with the RTA. And I just want to give you a brief current RTA planning process that will come up as we start talking about the next RTA planning process. As you can imagine, the revenue side of the RTA planning is very critical, and the budgeting process is an annual budgeting year. We are projecting a 15% potential reduction in revenue for the implementation of the RTA plan. We hope that the recovery, at least for this recession, is going to be a short recovery period, and we'll be able to come back and hopefully in late fall review our projections and, if needed, amend our budget. As you can imagine, this is really not a recession similar to the 2008 recession. It's very unpredictable as far as how the recovery is going to shape. So we want to have at least a quarter, if not 2 quarters, of revenue numbers, so we can come back and make a update to our budget. As you can imagine, as part of that same exercise, obviously we typically update our long-term revenue projections, and that's the next item on the agenda that we're going to have Jim to get a little bit more in detail on how we project our revenues and how we anticipate the dollars that are going to be available for the next plan. So I won't get into that too much. I'll let Jim talk about that a little bit later. But in addition to our revenue and expenditure exercise that is obviously critical in performance of any organization, we also do our own annual audits, and we have a regional transportation oversight committee that is formed of 21 citizens that provide that oversight. They've done a wonderful job of providing that oversight and making sure that we're meeting our commitments to the voters and delivering projects as promised. In addition to having our own oversight committee, we also have the state RTA, as you all know, is a subdivision of this state. The state, on the 10-year anniversary of the RTA, and then every 5 years thereafter, provides a performance review of the plan to make sure that we are spending the dollars where they're meant to be spent and in accordance to the plan. We're fortunate that when we had our 10-year performance review, we came with a lot of positive feedback, and our governing board, as well as the state that provides the oversight, they were very complimentary of the organization and the process and meeting our promise to the voters. We're coming up to do our 15-year, which is the next We are pleased to report to you that we believe we're going to do equally really right to the community, and we've delivered what we promised. As part of that conversation started, the chair of the audit committee is the president of the Senate, who is Senator Karen Fan. She was kind enough that in advance of our going into our process, she sent a very nice complimentary letter to our governing board and complimented not only the governing board but also the community for delivering on the RTA promise. So I just want to give you a little food for thought that as you develop the next plan, it will go through an extensive checks and balances. We do have our own internal audit. We have our CART committee and also the state audit process. And we're fortunate that our governing board has been staying consistent to their commitment, and they've been delivering as promised. Other than that, I'm going to leave the revenue discussion to the next item and allow Jim to get into that in a little bit more in depth. So the process as we move forward is obviously to identify the revenue for the next plan and then develop the expenditure that would have a balanced budget for that plan. So this is a beginning of the conversation on the financial and the management side of it. As you all know, we'll continue to develop the plan itself moving forward, but we thought it would be really important to dive into the financial side of it just as an overview, and that'll be an ongoing conversation. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any questions.
Have it delivered. Yeah.
Well, if consumers want to buy into those particular insurance coverages, then I fully support that. Early to make it available, but to mandate it across the board, I don't necessarily agree with that, especially if it's not pertaining to, for example, auto collisions per se. To mandate that, I think that
If everyone can please,
to a certain
we're
level.
hearing a side conversation. If you guys can hear me, someone can please mute their mic.
That as it pertains to any one of these policies, going back to my collaborative efforts, is to bring all stakeholders to the table and have these conversations and not just.
It has to be somebody
on my opinion of a policy alone. And so having these stakeholder meetings and having these conversations.
Edmund.
Much go back to what I.
Hello?
Driving, having conversations with Stuart.
It sounds like somebody's on the phone, so please, if you can hear us.
Stakeholders and to hear out from industry experts. I don't have a background.
Okay.
There we go. All right. Well, I'll pass it back to the chair. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thanks, Farhad. Let me ask Paki, do we have a quorum?
Yes, we do. I have 19 that are coming in through the computer. I'm not sure still how we can tell who's calling in, but I do have at least 19 on the computer system on WebEx.
All right, so before we get much farther, could I ask if everybody who's on for not showing up here would just announce that they're on the phone?
Roger Craycraft.
This is John Bernal.
Yolanda Herrera.
Chuck Doors on the phone to pick up the.
Okay, yeah, we see you, Chuck. Okay, thanks, everyone. Let's move on to our meeting minutes. I want to make a note here that during our last meeting, we had I think there were 3 people who responded to the call to audience, and at least a couple of them provided handouts to us. Although some of them may have been circulated. Want to let you know that as we promised at that meeting, that those would be made available to everyone. You're able to access through our website, through the CAC website. So if you want to see those attached, that's where they'll be. No, they're not exactly hard copy attached to the minutes that were sent out. So do we have any modifications to the minutes? And if not, do I have a motion to approve them?
Tom, can we take just 1 minute for us to notify that we're going to unmute all the mics so that we can get this done?
From Arizona, but Jim Click has given me his support and endorsement, as well as Bert Lopez, Umberto Lopez. I've some different individuals from the public safety, obviously given my background, have supported.
Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mary, and a second. See,
Chuck,
and any other comments? Any?
See out there that you think would be right for deregulation or regulatory reform.
As submitted, say aye.
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 Opposed? Thank you. Motion carries. Hey, Paki, I wonder if maybe you or Julie or somebody could make a call to Edmund's office and let him know that he needs to be muted.
I will contact him right now.
Okay, good. Thanks. All right.
Hey, Tom, this is Carolyn. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm also on my phone, but I'm also with the audio. But and I was muted, so I wasn't able to make a comment about this. But could you explain about why we don't have those written comments that we had said we're going to attach to the minutes from the audience call to the audience?
Yeah, I did. Those were the handouts that were provided to us during, and those are for everyone on the CAC website.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, it's kind of cutting in and out for me, so I wasn't able to hear that part. Thank you, Tom.
You bet. Okay, so let's move on to revenue projections. And Jim, we have about a half an hour set aside for this. It's all yours. Except you're still muted.
I'm unmuted now. Great. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the RTA-CAC. I'm going to give you a brief overview of how we arrive at our projections for the RTA. We do this on a periodic basis. We update our objective or our revenue projections. And I'm going to give you a little bit of the process, if you will. First of all, we use the Eller College at the University of Arizona, their Economic and Business Research Center. You may remember that when we did the original 2006 effort, Marshall Vest was still was overseeing that center. It's now George Hammond. We continue to work with them, and we do updates basically every 2 to 3 years. And when we do these forecasts, they're basically looking back at where we've been and then projecting out into the future. We generally look out between 25 and 30 years to look at trends. And these trends that we look at don't include specific significant financial events like there being a way to predict a recession or something like what we're going through right now with COVID-19, the pandemic, but it looks at long-term trends. the forecast that we have done is done as a part of the forecasting project. And the Economic Business and Research Center, what they do is they look at the state and how the state's growth and what the state's economy looks at. And then they do a subset for each of the major metropolitan statistical areas. So they've got a subset that looks at the Maricopa County area and what's driving their economy, and they do one that looks at Pima County. And all of this is underpinned by part of the IHS market program, which don't ask me what that means because I'm not sure I entirely understand. The economists utilize as kind of their national understanding of long-term trends. Moving on, what the Eller Center looks at is a number of our most significant call them business industries. They are listed on the slide before you. Clearly, the most significant is retail. That represents probably close to 60% of the total take that we get on a monthly basis, and that fluctuates cyclically dependent upon what's happening, in the retail cycle. As you might well imagine, our most profitable month or our largest the month with our largest revenue is the month of December. And what it does is that when we receive it, or when the sales are transacted, we receive a check about 2 months later. So what we'll report as, say, the holiday season, which might be the month of December, a little bit into November perhaps, that will then turn out into a deposit that we receive on a cash basis during the month of February. All of these, when the forecasting project develops their estimates, they're looking at taxable sales. They're not looking at necessarily how much is being produced from a sales tax rate, because everybody's sales tax rate is a little different. They use the same data for perhaps these kinds of numbers are based on total gross sales. And then what we do is apply a sales tax rate to it, which for most of our industries is half cent or 0.005 dollars per dollar of taxable sales. There is a little bit of an increase for hotel and motel sales. It's about it's 0.55 cents per dollar. And then there's another one out there that's a minor amount, which is about 0.3. And things like aviation fuel, things like that, they all have little different tax rates. Whoops, there we go. What they do then is produce a forecast, and when they forecast it, they do it in nominal dollars. That's year of collection dollars. So it is in growth. It's inclusive of increases as a result of inflation. So it's an inflation is a deflated amount where we take out the effects of inflation and put it in what we, in this case, the most recent forecast was in 2020 dollars. When we did the original RTA plan, it was in 2006 dollars. And that allows us to compare, without the impacts of inflation, a project cost to the revenue that we're taking in. And for instance, when we looked at the RTA plan in 2006, it was $2.1 billion in 2006 dollars, whereas the inflated amount was much greater than that. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction with my cursor here. Okay, anyway, this is what we're looking at based upon our most recent projection. It was given to us in April of last year, so it's a little over a year old now. What we do is we ask them, the Eller Business and Research Center, to give us a baseline forecast, which is the forecast in red. And then we asked them to bracket it, basically look at an optimistic and a pessimistic forecast. So the optimistic forecast, which you see is consistently higher throughout in that dashed line, And then we have a pessimistic forecast, which interestingly actually crosses over and grows higher than the baseline forecast. You ask, why is that? Well, the reason that is occurring is because the baseline or the pessimistic forecast includes a greater amount of inflation. Taking these forecasts, we then deflate them down and look at what it would look like in 2020 dollars. And oh, by the way, when you look to the far left-hand side of the graph, to the left, you can see a vertical line that is shown at 2018. That line represents the data that was present at the time of the forecast. Further to the left, you'll see a blue shaded area. That's the period or that's reflected by the recession that we had back in 2008. Now, shifting this over to 2020 dollars, what does it look like? This is the growth rate, the annual growth rate that we would see. You can see the growth rate in 2020 dollars. The red line represents the baseline, and you can see that it actually is pretty generous back in 2018, and that was showing it tapering off a little bit. Was that the reason it spiked there in 2018 is because we were seeing very good growth. And in fact, it continued at a very high level of growth up until the recession hit, or the pandemic hit, basically in March. In fact, going into the pandemic in March, we were growing. We had a growth rate year to date of over 6%. So it would actually have been higher than the line that's shown there. But when you're looking at long term, you're more reflective of what's happening in our economy in the long term, and that's what this intended to present. So you see that we were enjoying a little bit of a burst in 2018, and that it would taper off and normalize more in the 2020 to 2024 period. And then from that point out, it grows at a rate that's pretty close to a rate of population growth, which was 0.7%, and that's what the state is estimating for our population growth. Again, you look at the solid black line with the circles in it. That's the pessimistic forecast, and you can see that in the pessimistic forecast, we're looking at basically no. In the optimistic forecast, it's closer to about 1% growth in the 2020 dollars. Moving on, what does that mean in terms of real dollars in a given year? This is what the forecasts look like. It was looking at about $90 million being collected this year, and then it either stays static at about $90 million a year. Again, this is adjusted 2020 dollars. So the no growth scenario, which is the pessimistic forecast, the baseline forecast, which would see us growing from about $90 million a year to $110 million a year. And now this is going out all the way to 2048. We looked at a 30-year forecast from 2018. And then obviously the optimistic forecast is higher. So where do we go from here? Our next step is really to, the findings first, some things that are notable about our economy. The age of our average age of the population is growing. And with that, there are natural shifts in consumption patterns. When you're looking at an aging population, there is a shift from buying consumer items, consumption, if you will, and shifting more towards services in the long term, particularly healthcare services. And that's something that's reflected in here. That's why our growth isn't much more than the growth in the population. We are looking at, again, about a 0.7% growth per year in the Tucson metro area. And then obviously you've got the pessimistic and optimistic forecasts that bracket that baseline. Now, going forward, what is it that we're looking at doing? We know that we're in a changing environment right now, and we know that we're going to have to update the revenue estimate before we can really move into fixing how much it is that we're going to put into the RTA plan. So we need to get through basically the most volatile portion of this pandemic-related recession, and then we can start looking at where we're going from there in a longer growth term. So we're looking at doing some estimates late this year, or perhaps even early next year. Be a little bit out of our normal cycle, but not unreasonably so. It'll be about the 2-year point when we get that next estimate. And as I said, it's really, we're in too volatile a period of time to take a look at, to reasonably forecast what's going to be beyond that. Then what do we do with that? Identify what they think is the appropriate dollar value that we set as a target for the RTA plan, obviously with your input. So that is, in a nutshell, our forecasting process. Again, we do it cyclically every 2 to 3 years, and have since we started. If we were to look at the nominal dollar figure of what we might collect over the next 20 years, nominal dollar on this earlier estimate would be about $2.5 billion, which would deflate to maybe $1.9 billion in 2020 numbers. The pessimistic would obviously be less than that. So with that, Mr. Chair, that is a very quick overview of how we do our revenue estimates. I can stand for any questions and share with you what we're seeing in the changes in our economy. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Jim. I wonder if you could just give us once more, I think you started off the conversation with this, but I, for one, could use a refresher on the reason for deflating or bringing back to present value the forecasted amounts. And what is it that we present to voters ultimately? When we said 2.1 billion was our estimate, the first go round, we were assuming those were in current day dollars or not?
Yeah, the estimate. I know it's confusing, and sometimes even the terms I use are a little. But when we did the estimate back in 2006, we did a forecast, a baseline forecast, and an optimistic and a pessimistic forecast. In nominal dollars, the estimate was $2.8 billion was what we were going to collect back in what we thought we would collect in nominal dollars between 2006 and 2026. That deflated to $2.1 billion in 2006 dollars. And that was what we used as the number that we reflected to the voters. We were very clear in saying 2006 dollars throughout all of our literature. What it allows us to do is to look at construction costs that are current. We don't know what will happen with inflation. At the time, we were in a modest inflation mode. We continue in that very modest inflation mode right now, but things can change over time. And so we felt that it was best to reflect it in present day, at the time, 2006 dollars. And we think that still makes a lot of sense. It's much easier for us to estimate the construction cost of a project in today's dollars than it would be for us inflation factoring. And we can do that, but it tends to make the dollars look really out of scale for what the projects are. So we think that reflecting it in current day dollars is the right way to go.
As an example, if you were to have a major corridor project in the fourth quintile of fourth 5-year period, it may be the same, the same nominal cost as one in the first period, yet, you might have 50% or 100% higher actual number at that time. So I understand that, and certainly for us in the here and now to be able to make decisions about projects and comparative value of projects as we have to cut various projects out of the overall plan, I think it makes a lot of sense. Do we have any questions from the panel for Jim? And because most recent conversation that we had about elements was about the safety element, and received copies of arose that didn't have a chance to answer at our last meeting. I'd like to turn it over to him now and ask if he could lead us through kind of what those questions and answers are, as well as take any additional questions that we might have or comments. Thank you, Jim, and welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Fine.
Wonderful. All right, good morning, everybody. Nice to see some friendly faces out there. I will go ahead and run through the questions that we did receive from the CAC to the best of our knowledge. I think it's important to keep in mind the task at hand of the CAC may not necessarily be to intimately acquaint yourselves with various ways of understanding crash data per se, but to answer the question of is the RTA safety element structured in such a way that we feel it is doing what it should be doing to deliver safety throughout the region. So keep that in mind, certainly. It looks like I don't have control of the slides, so Crystal, if you could advance me, that would be wonderful. All right, so the first question that we had was related to RTA projects under the signal technology improvement category, and what kind of projects are we looking at and what kind of examples. So within that sub-element, or the categorical as it's sometimes called, we've launched approximately 30 different projects that have been approved to date. And those projects generally have ranged fairly significantly. Some of them are simple traffic signal hardware purchases, upgrading equipment such as signal controllers or other traffic signal stuff. Others have been battery backup units to ensure that if there is a power outage at some locations, there is battery life that will run that intersection continuously for another period of time while technicians can get out there and repair it. And then important, and what you'll hear a little bit later, is the communications connection element to and from signalized intersections is a very important piece. And we want to make sure that we're funding that to the best of our abilities to make sure that signals are behaving and working properly as they should be. So that's a little bit of variety of the types of projects that we've seen. And again, we've seen fairly low cost projects down in the $30,000 range up to higher cost projects. The important thing to note is that the vast majority of these projects are very well coordinated through the jurisdictions, through the PAG RTA Transportation Systems and Safety Subcommittee. So that group has been tasked with overseeing the projects that come out of this sub-element. And so they're evaluating what are the right investments for signal technology region-wide so that we can make sure that we're staying in step with one another. So a lot of great coordination there. So moving right along, the next question we received was related to bicycle and pedestrian crash rates and how they're determined. In the presentation that I provided in March, we used a few different types of crash rate analyses. Crash rates for vulnerable users is a bit tricky because ensuring that you understand how many vulnerable users are out there becomes a real challenge. The industry standard at this point is to look at the number of crashes per million vehicle miles traveled. So we use that as one example, but we're continuing to explore other crash rate opportunities to understand the data and understand the issue for vulnerable user safety as we move forward. So a couple of the others include looking at the census commute rates and how much of the census respondents are saying that their commute is done by bicycle or walking. And then we also did an analysis to look at different bicycle facilities throughout the region. And because we've had a long-standing bicycle and pedestrian count program, we were able to bring bicycle miles traveled to that analysis. So we did it a few different ways, but really the apples to apples comparison, when you want to look at other areas or other metro areas or compare states to states, traditionally they're going to look at per million vehicle miles traveled for the particular location or area. If you could advance the slide, please.
Hey, Paul, before you finish on that one,
Yes.
do you have reliable bike and ped counts from other similar sized or peer communities that you can use, even if you're using the vehicle miles traveled rather than bike miles traveled or pedestrian miles walked, where you can at least provide a benchmark, how we're doing, or you know, to at least say, well, you know, Denver walks as much as we do, or they have, you know, a very extensive bicycle community like Tucson does. So let's try to compare here.
We could look at that. There are some limitations there in that the calculation for vehicle miles traveled typically varies a little bit. So we were able to compare the Pima County numbers for all crashes within Pima County to the state numbers for vehicle miles traveled because the VMT or vehicle mile traveled methodology was the same. It does vary a little bit from state to state. There can be some comparisons, but we're going to want to take a grain of salt with that as we look across different communities. Certainly, census data would be another resource to understand how much commuting is happening in particular peer communities. That would give us a clearer understanding as well.
Good, thanks.
All right, so certainly. So another question we received was in regards to intersection technology and what technology is an example of an ideal intersection. So this is where the coordination really comes into play for the six. There's not really a hard and fast set of intersection standards who share their practices amongst one another, but this may be an opportunity for us to help out and with our member agencies. Wanting to reinvent, we could integrate this a little bit more tightly. So when we look at an ideal intersection, we're looking at a variety of different features. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that we have reliable high-speed communication to and from that signal, as that signal is attempting to exchange data with the central system to ensure that it is in coordination with the signals around it. And if it is serving a corridor progression. So we're looking at fiber optic cable There's a wireless connection to signals. Again, those uninterrupted power supplies and those types of things to make sure there is coordination and that it is stable. All of you have probably experienced some internet outages as you've been doing more telework during the pandemic. Same type of condition exists for communications to and from traffic signals. So we want to make sure that's very hardened and very stable and consistent as much as we can. When we look at the equipment at the location, we also want to make sure that we have up-to-date and contemporary traffic signal controllers. This is effectively like the traffic signal computer. The newer traffic signal controllers are able to integrate data exchange related to vehicle to infrastructure communications so that the new built vehicles can exchange information with the traffic signal, and the traffic signal can send information to the vehicle, and the vehicle can know that you are going to get a green light at your arrival in 22 seconds, or the light will be red when you arrive. So the vehicle can then begin to prepare. So we want to make sure we have contemporary traffic signal controllers to get the most out of our entire network as much as possible. We want to make sure that we can do this in a life cycle replacement process. We're not plus signal controllers at once. So we want to make sure that we have a recent crop of contemporary signal controllers throughout the region. We also want to make sure that the detection equipment at the locations is up to date. The detection equipment is used for the delivery of different phases of the traffic signal. You've probably experienced where there's been a left turn serviced for a vehicle that's not there. That effectively is a detection device saying, I'm not sure if there's a vehicle there, or I think there is, I'm going to serve that phase. So the tighter we can get that, and the better working we can get that, we can eliminate those ghost phase deliveries and have more efficiency out of the total network, and it will run a little bit better. We want to make sure that we have up-to-date preemption and vehicle priority equipment at the intersections. Traditionally, this has been in the form of preemption, where an emergency vehicle comes and trips the signal, changes it immediately. The newer approach to this is preparatory vehicle priority delivery, where the signal knows when the vehicle is going to arrive, and it can do like a quick clear out phase to prepare for the arrival of that emergency vehicle, which means less disruption to the entire efficiency of the signal and the network itself. So that's where the technology is going, and we want to make sure that we're up to date on that. Signal heads, mast arms, push buttons, all of those things make up a contemporary traffic signal installation, and we want to make sure that we're meeting all those current standards. And then we certainly want to make sure that we have software support and regular review of the operational and signal time plans. Traditionally, this is a responsibility of the local agency. The local agencies have been really great sharing that information with one another, because you as a traveler in the network don't really care who owns the particular signal that you're arriving at. And you want to make sure that one and the one that you'll arrive at next is in coordination. They may be owned by two different entities, but you as a user of the system shouldn't need to care about that. So we want to make sure that we keep those coordinated, both of the signals and with the entities who own the equipment. Next slide, please. So when we ask ourselves how many intersections meet that standard, which was a follow-up question we received, when you look at the total assembly of what's needed, there's only a few that meet that ideal intersection that we just identified above. Oftentimes, it's not a full purchase of everything that needs to be done at a signal unless it's a reconstruct of an intersection. In that case, we get lucky. And we have a good portion of things off our list that are updated at that particular intersection. As we look at life cycle replacement opportunities, we should be able to get the ideal intersection number up a little bit higher. So how many need to be upgraded? We need to look at all of them, really. We need to look at all 604 signalized intersections in the region. We need to look at them as a network and ensure that they are working properly and that we're investing in that area to make it so. So the next question we got was regards to future proofing that needs to be done to for future improvement capabilities. As I mentioned earlier.
Hey, stop.
We want to make sure that we're looking at coordinating life cycle replacement programs with the agencies that own this equipment. So any opportunity that we can create that helps them know when they will have new detection equipment and know when they will have a new traffic signal controller coming for particular intersections would be very, very helpful for the operators of the network. Next slide, please. So this question, the three strategies emphasized in the safety presentation were engineering, education, and enforcement. How much RTA funding, if any, has been spent on education and enforcement? Are operational expenses for such efforts legal using RTA funds? So we remind you here that the RTA's role is to support the infrastructure portion of the strategies. A number of intersections that were promised to the when the initiative was first went out. There have not been any transfer funds between the sub-elements, and we should mention that the delivery goals of the traffic signal technology category were a bit difficult to come by. So we're just making sure that we have that coordination with the agency owners and operators, and that we're making the wisest investment for traffic signal as possible. The other categories, such as intersections, Jim has told you numerous times, we're on track to deliver there. We're in pretty good shape. We want to keep a keen eye on what's being delivered and what opportunities there are with the projects to come. Next slide, please.
Okay. Paul, before you move on.
Sure.
Could you go back to number 7 just for a second? I wanted to get a clarification for everybody about that education piece. I understand that the state law that enables the RTA excludes us from using the money on education and enforcement. How exactly are we using are we categorizing the Main Street business support element of the RTA?
I'm glad you asked. I'm going to kind of kick that one over to Jim. I know he's got some information to share with you later in the agenda, but maybe he could give you a little overview of how that special program is allowable and delivered within the RTA structure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The RTA, in the RTA plan, we were very clear in setting aside funds for the Main Street Business Assistance Program and scoped it out for the voters. And that is because it's in that basically the authority that we're that gives us the ability to spend those funds on that. And it really is a mitigation of the business or the impacts of a construction project. So we felt that that was well grounded in the plan.
So more related to acquisition and relocation of businesses, which is an allowable portion of the money, correct?
Yeah, I mean it's public to some extent. It's really public outreach. I mean, when we do a very good job of reaching out to neighborhood associations and the like, Businesses are more focused on doing their business. And they really kind of, in many cases, are checked out what's being developed. And this is a way for us to go out and reach out to them. The other thing that the Business Assistance Program does is it makes sure that we're getting things like construction signage for business access signage and things like that. And it's really, it's business directed communications that wouldn't otherwise be occurring.
Very good, thank you. Okay, back to you, Paul.
That's all I had for you today, Mr. Chair, but if you do have any follow-up questions, please send them to staff, and we'll continue to chip away at the safety issues and improve safety by understanding it and delivering safety-oriented projects.
Thanks, Paul. Overall, I think this has been a really helpful process of learning about safety and kind of what current thinking is, and we appreciate your patience in getting us process. So as we're doing very well on our schedule, we're only an hour in. We're going to let Jim DeGrood drone on for at least an hour. Couldn't resist. I
promise not to. I know I have that rep, but promise to try to keep this fairly succinct.
We're going to go back to the environmental and economic vitality element, and I did want to make sure that we left plenty of time since I switched the agenda items here, and looking forward to this and some conversation with the committee about it. Thank you, Jim.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. of the CAC. I'm going to give you an overview, very high-level overview of the last of the four elements that we have to talk about today, and that's the environmental and economic vitality element. That element is, whoops, let's see here. If I can, there we go. Thank you. I have control of the screen now. As I said, it's the fourth element, a little bit about the corridor improvement projects, the ones that are going to be coming out in the transit element, which was the first of the categoricals that you heard about, and then the safety element, which Paul has responded to questions on. The environmental and economic vitality element is made up of three sub-elements. They're actually kind of size-wise in the order that they're presented here. The first and the most significant size-wise is the greenways, pathways, bikeways, and sidewalks element. Talk about that first. And then I'll follow up with a brief discussion on what's going on with our transportation-related critical wildlife linkages. And the final sub-element that we'll talk about, and we touched on just a moment ago, is the small business assistance, which is our Main Street Business Assistance Program. So first, let's talk about the greenways, pathways, bikeways, and sidewalks. When we approached this back in 2006, we knew that was in our sidewalk and bike lane network, and what the working groups that were putting together the plan identified were some goals, and they also basically said they wanted to break up the investment into three equal subsets, if you paths that are outside of the traveled way, roadways. Bikeways, obviously, when equates those with existing surface transportation facilities, roads, and then sidewalks, which are adjacent to the road. We recognize that there is also a demand that we have to serve critical facilities like schools and the like with both sidewalk and bicycle facilities. So that was kind of the premise going into the RTA plan. And we've really, the League of American Bicyclists, well, we are a region, and we were the first region to get that recognition. And one of the things as we've looked to try to build on our reputation like we reached out to the League of American Bicyclists and at least the bicycling community did, and asked, what is it that we really need to look at to try to improve the way we provide our facilities? And what they came back with was a record. That's really where we've gone over the last decade, is looking at making sure that we can serve both the skilled bicyclists, those people, they jokingly referred to as the spandex crowd. They're out there on the roadways, they're moving with traffic, they're able to safely negotiate traffic. Not that there aren't improvements that need to be done on the roadways, and we're working on those, but that's a distinct different user group than the others that we've got in here. We know that there are youth out on our roads. We need to make sure that we're providing safe routes for them to get to school. Destination for our youth, the recreation areas and so forth. We've got recreational users that they may be out there for the exercise of it, and some of them have varying levels of skills. And so we need to recognize that there are recreational users as well as your day-to-day commuter type users. We've got disabled users out there in the community that we need to make sure that we're providing for adequately, and that's been a real big push as a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And then there are the first time or the very a low stress environment to get comfortable with riding their bikes and walking and so forth. So we need to recognize that there are a diversity, or there's a diversity of users out there, and that's really what we've been evolving the plan towards. And in recognition of that, we now have a series of other plans out there that supplement and that we've invested in. For instance, on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see the Tucson Bikeways map. Not only are we involved in building those road-related bike lanes on our major arterials, but we've also worked with primarily the city and to a lesser extent the county and towns, collector streets within residential areas that probably 25-mile-an-hour roadways, ones that we can improve the safety and the markings for these so there's a continuous path that people can use. Oftentimes we'll coordinate it with pedestrian and bike crossings at the major arterials that they intersect with. And the map on the left shows in green a lot of these bikeways. For instance, I think most people are familiar with the Third Street bikeway that goes into the mall at the University of Arizona and extends as far east as Craycroft now, and we'll be going beyond that. We also, when we were doing work on the Grant Road corridor, we heard that Grant Road wasn't necessarily a comfortable place for people to bicycle on. Maybe we needed to look at doing something to the north and south, and with that, the Copper Street bikeway took shape, and we're now, in fact, if you are driving around town, you'll start seeing some of the construction of the pedestrian and bicycle facilities along the Copper Street bikeway at Stone and First Avenue. Right now, there's new pedestrian bike signals going on there. Additionally, we've got the loop, which has been underway. The county made it a priority decades ago, and we have in segments of it where there have been gaps. So there are pieces of the loop that we've invested in. So that's really been kind of the strategy, looking for gaps and making sure that we're beginning to address the diverse user group that we've got on the bicycle and pedestrian network. So moving on, that's the first of the sub-elements. The next is our transportation-related critical wildlife linkages, and that we've focused most of our investment in bricks and mortar on these, looking at providing physical crossings that of wildlife and exclusion. So we're looking at coupling a crossing with protective fencing to keep the wildlife out of the roadways, and then funnel the wildlife into safe crossings, passages. Some of them are under passes, some are overpasses. Really depends on what the wildlife is that we're looking at that's in the area. But what we're trying to do is make sure that we're looking at it from a landscape level. You know, where are the corridors of movement? And there have been a number of them that have been identified. The one that we've probably invested the most heavily in is that connection between the Tortolita Mountains and the Catalina Mountain. Have a lot of investment that we've looked at on some of our other key corridors. You know, if we've got a corridor parallel to a river, you know, typically, you know, wildlife will move from the foothills to the river. Looking at movement between these large blocks of open space, and that's really what we've been focused on. Where we have invested has been, we're looking at fairly small mammals. In others, we're looking at deer and larger animals. So they all have their own facility needs, if you will. And we've done a little bit of work to try to understand what those needs are with a little bit of limited study. We also have looked at opportunities. And we know that if, say, the state of Arizona is looking at a major project, when they reconstruct a roadway, if we have a need that's identified for wildlife movement, when they reconstruct it is the time to act. Doing projects standalone is very financially inefficient. If we can couple it with a project that is moving forward, we can deliver it much more affordably than we could otherwise. If the road's already torn up, if you have to widen the culvert or do something. So we have done that in conjunction with a number of state highway projects. Oracle Road and State Route 86 are two examples of that. And again, it's all about looking at the landscape level movement and trying to keep the wildlife out and funnel them through to where they need to go. And then the final element I wanted to talk about in the environmental and economic vitality element, the Main Street Business Assistance Program. There we go. And you know what it does is it provides a number of services to the business community to allow our businesses to survive and hopefully thrive after the completion of a new project. We know that businesses, particularly retail businesses, if they're alongside of a major corridor, they will see a diminution in business activity as a result of the project. People will try to stay away from a construction zone. They will have a difficult time finding an access to a business. It really hurts those businesses that are along those corridors. And so what we've attempted to do is, or what we are doing, it's not attempted, what we are doing is reaching out to those businesses well in advance of a project so they can plan. And we're assisting them in planning experience. We've reached out, I think Britton was telling me this morning that Britton Dornquist is our Main Street Business Assistance Manager. Britton was telling me this morning that we've touched over 9,100 businesses to date. These are businesses that to be in the program, you have to be within a quarter of a mile of a road project. Most of the people are on, or most of these businesses are fronting on a road project. Some, you know, perhaps on the side street that intersects. But these are projects that, or these are businesses that are directly impacted by our road projects. And for a road project, that might mean 2 years of business disruption. If the businesses aren't aware of it going into it, they're really ill-prepared to deal with the effects. We also advocate's probably too strong a word, but we serve as a conduit of communication between the businesses themselves and the project team. So the project team is aware of what is transpiring in the corridor from a business standpoint. You know, if there are particular events that are coming up that a business might have, we need to coordinate that with any activities that a road project might have on it. things that we will provide businesses are some tangible services. For instance, we will provide mapping services to the businesses in the program, maps so that they can provide their clients, their customers, with maps on where to access their businesses, how to get in and out. Give them specific information and detail about when they might see disruptions associated with the project, road shifts. There are, if there's the need to shut down the water line, you need to let time to prepare for it, because that could be catastrophic to that business when that happens. So these are the kinds of things that the RTA Main Street program does. They are about providing quality, timely information about a project to the businesses that fund it. They are about providing tangible goods, services, things that they can use as they are going through the construction period, and they are a conduit of information, so that the project teams know what's going on with the businesses along the corridor, and that way they can help with project or problem resolution. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Main Street Business Assistance Program does. I can't speak highly enough of them. They really have done a lot to try to help keep businesses informed of what's going on and help them survive the downturn that will be experienced. With that, Mr. Chair, that really is a high-level overview of the environmental and economic vitality element and the three sub-elements within it. With that, I would be delighted to respond to any questions that folks might have.
Okay, thank you, Jim. I thought I saw earlier that Britton Dornquist was on the call. I wonder if he'd like to add anything to the Main Street conversation, perhaps an idea of how it's going and whether changes to it might be worthwhile in the upcoming RTA Next.
Can you hear me, Tom?
Yeah, I can hear you, Britton.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Britton Dornquist, the Program Manager for the Main Street Business Assistance Program. Our program has evolved throughout the whole process. We've done a number of changes as we've moved along through the process. The businesses we do a lot of feedback process for our focus groups to information about things that they would like to see us improve in or do differently. And as a result, we've tweaked our program at different points along the way. Give you an example, one of the things we've done here 43 months ago is we started providing a much more comprehensive constant contact direct email product to the businesses. We have all their emails, and we've been sending a lot more updates, a lot more business related products to them. To give you an idea, we've sent out 480 different emails, totaling 70 to 70,000 businesses, essentially, in terms of those emails being sent to them. They've found that very, very helpful. It's a 40% open rate, and they really appreciate it. So that's something that's just happened in the last 3 years. So each step along the way, we're always asking and tweaking and modifying and adjusting to make a difference for the end product, which is the business itself. So that might be an example of something that we've just done recently. Happy to answer any other questions.
Very good. Thank you for that. And all the reports I hear about it are as glowing as Jim's version was as well. So thanks for that work that you do. Jim, we do have a question from a panelist, and I'll try to give it a justice here. And when I fail, then Edmund, you can jump in. But the question is about the possibility of extension of the loop from Tankaverde to Craycroft Road along the Pantana Wash, where it currently kind of ends and jogs and has to be rerouted to Craycroft Road. And you know, what's the latest on that you hear?
Well, I don't have terribly current information. I know that there is no bank protection along that section of the Pantana Wash, the piece that's going behind the backside of Tucson Country Club. I know that the Regional Flood Control District has an engineer. His name is Andy Denauer, and Andy had been reaching out to property owners in that reach of.
Well, I guess I'm wondering which section this is, because I just actually rode the loop Saturday. Yeah, Saturday. And there's a stretch in there that's been completed. You have to make kind of a weird jog to get on the other side of the bank to the south side of the Pantana. Across the road anymore.
Yeah, this is Edmund. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, so right there at Craycroft, it actually splits off north and south. I think Jim was describing it correctly. It's you guys said Pantana. I thought that was more Rito maybe, but it does. It goes to the north side of Tucson Country Club, and it would reach all the way to Tankaverde, past the overpass. Big area. I mean, so a lot of cyclists going through that area. So right now, you have us all diverting south, and then we're having to get on Tankaverde and actually riding Tankaverde to try to go out towards Mount Lemon, et cetera. You would save a lot of cyclists from actually being out in the middle of the road. And not to put anyone on the spot, but I'm close with the Caesar family, and they're one of the owners there for that property. Speaking with Larry Caesar, he said they're very open to doing a deal for an easement so that they could continue the loop to that far stretch of Tankaverde.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for that. And that's one that we'll probably ask for a little more information about as the county provides its information to us when we get their project list. Any other questions that folks have for Jim?
Tom, I believe Arlen had a question to clarify something. Arlen, are you on?
Okay.
Maybe that's why he's just been chatting. We had two questions, but he didn't say what they were, so I thought he wanted to talk about it. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Is there somebody who's wanting to make a comment or ask further questions?
I would like to. This is Carolyn.
Yeah, yes.
Somebody's not got a really good connection there. Carolyn, go ahead and ask your.
Well, I had a couple of them, but I think I was thought that that's how we were doing it. But I'm going back to the legislation, the RTA legislation that does not allow education. And Jim was talking about how it is allowed to have public relations, and then when I'm confused by the difference in the legislation. Like, how do they differentiate that? Because what it sounds like from what Britton and Jim were talking about with the business program, they're educating the consumers. So how does that, can somebody explain that to me, Jim?
I will partially answer it, but I think Mr. Mogini might have some further information. Plan stated that we would be doing a business assistance program, identified what it would be. What we didn't identify is any kind of other education or law enforcement activities. So because we didn't identify it in the plan, it can't be funded with the plan. And I think Mr. Mogini may have some further amplification that he might want to put on it if I missed the mark.
Mute, unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, can you hear me? The legal folks to help us identify. And so on that note, once there is a plan, once there is a recommendation, the entire recommendation goes through a legal review. At that time can figure out what are legally allowed and what's not legally allowed. The legislation is very specific. There's a list of things that are eligible for expenditure. And there are in my opinion, they're very clear. But again, as I mentioned, once legal review, at that point, our attorneys can determine what can stay and what is not eligible.
Okay, just to follow up on that, the point of my question, and I'm not sure if I understand the answer, because Jim said it isn't allowed because it wasn't in the plan, but from what you're saying is it's actually specifically listed as enforcement as not allowed, as opposed to it just wasn't in the plan, and we could put it in this plan. I don't know who asked that question. I was looking for the answer as if we could put it in, or is it explicitly not allowed?
So I can come back at a later point and give you the list of what is eligible and what's not eligible. But anything related to planning, design, construction, and in support of planning, design, and construction is eligible. But we can provide the list for you at a later time. At the very end of the process, obviously, we don't want to include something, so we go through a legal review at that time. And if the legal opinion at that time is that something is not eligible, then it cannot be included.
Okay, thank you. And Tom, can I just have one more question and a comment, and then I'm done with my question?
Thomas is promised.
The other one that discussion brought up, and that's not my dog. I have a big dog, and he's quiet. When we were talking about intelligent traffic systems or whatever, and hopefully we will get some kind of a presentation one of these days, because it sounds like the city and the county both wanted that or are considering it. But when that was brought up, what we got from the RTA staff instead, I can't remember exactly what it was called. It was Rick Ellis's, but it's fully functional corridors, or having that new fully functional corridor as part of our guiding principles. So I guess, and Jim or whoever, when we're talking about the bikeways and greenways and that part, the sidewalks, what is the difference of having, because that's kind of what Rick talked about when he talked about fully functional corridors, it's like whatever we need in that particular area. And proposing that we do with the bikeways and sidewalks is just make that into fully functional, that category, or part of not having a category anymore, because the staff seem to not want to have an intelligent traffic system category, subcategory, whatever. I don't know who wants to answer that. That was all.
Well, I guess very briefly, I think what we would advocate for is continuing to have actually advocate's not the word, but the bikeways, greenways, pathways, and sidewalks, I expect that there will be a demand for continued investment in those areas, as well as any components of those within a fully functional roadway or a complete street, if you will. That I would expect us to continue to do. I know that with the With the safety element, there was also a component that dealt with traffic signal improvements that I think we would expect to continue to invest in as well. And I hope I answered your question.
Yes, but we're not having a complete streets category. Those two related, because that's where that one discussion went. That's all. And Mr. Chair, I'll save my comment for another time. I'm done.
Okay, very good. Any other questions for Jim or for any of the other presentations that we've heard today?
Yes, Chuck Dorr for Jim, please. Jim, I know how extensive the budgeting process is for revenue, and I'm really.
If you'll recall, we had a $2.1 billion plan that we'd identified. At the time that we identified it, we thought that related to nominal dollars that were about $2.8 billion. That was their baseline projection at the time. If you look at nominal dollars, now nominal dollars include inflation, and inflation has not matched what we thought it would be. But in terms of nominal dollars, where we will like the 2.1 that was in 2006 dollars, the inflated amount. We worked with the board beginning in 2013 to identify other regional funds that could be brought to bear to make sure that we delivered the project or list that the voters voted on, and we've been working diligently on trying to make sure that that's occurred. So yes, the number, because of the Great Recession, the number's less than we thought. We took a big dip, and we've been growing out of it. But that money that we lost from 2008 to 2013 is lost. And at the same time, we saw some construction projects costs fall. So I mean, is managing to deliver to the ballot amount with the resources that we've got available, and I believe we'll achieve that even with the latest COVID-19 related drop-offs, assuming that it doesn't get too much worse than it already is.
Thank you, Jim.
Anyone here? Yeah. I'm sorry, we can't hear you, whoever it is. If you're trying to contact us, maybe you could try putting it in the chat box. Aki, can you tell who's trying to speak?
It appears that it was Ted Maxwell, I believe, that was on the phone. Ted, are you on?
I'm on, but I'm not on the phone, and I'm not trying to speak.
Okay, you were just unmuted. And then Mel was also appearing, wanting to say something.
Okay. Go right ahead.
Looks like they've disappeared.
Okay, well, technologically, we seem to be going downhill here at the last. Any other questions before I entertain a motion to adjourn? Although one last question about future meetings. If he has any update on
Sure.
likely to go and whether we can expect any more virtual meetings through the summer.
Sure, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, as you all are following some of the potential guidelines towards social distancing and having a large group. We don't anticipate having an in-person meeting in July. Most likely July will be virtual as well. And then from that point on, it's obviously we'll have to take it day by day, and hopefully if we're able to have a in-person meeting, we'll accommodate that as soon as possible. But we do plan on having meetings in July and August, so please continue to hold those dates and those times. And if we have to, we'll continue to do it virtually. As you can imagine, it's going to be very difficult to have 50-some people in a small room. So I don't anticipate an in-person meeting, at least over the next couple of months.
Thanks.
These, I can see this is educational here, but it would be rather difficult for action items. Are you considering just doing more education on elements or getting presentations from other jurisdictions or anything like that? Because I can't even imagine trying to like have a discussion and vote and plus not having a call to the audience really. So
yeah, we don't anticipate any action items at least in the near term. We're still continuing the dialogue, obviously on the educational side, as well as making sure that we can compile enough input. So I don't anticipate having a virtual meeting for any major action items.
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Among the things to be looked at, I suppose, are whether a different venue that would allow for social distancing and still, a way for us to see each other in person might work sometime this fall, once we really dive into doing these, negotiations, if you will. But a lot yet to be determined. One last comment I'd like to make: if there are any of the public who are listening to this, either now or afterwards, via the YouTube channel or however it ends up being recorded, that want to make comments, you'll have that opportunity through PAG, through the RTA, to make those provided then to the committee separately. So, Paki, do we have an email? Well,
Mr. Chair, it's rtamobility.com and it's on the agenda.
Oh, it is.
Sorry, Tom, I was on a separate call. Yes, info@rtmobility.com on the CAC agenda.
Sorry, I guess I should have read my own agenda, huh? Very good. Do I have a motion for adjournment or any last objections?